Ready to dive into a topic that's pretty much impossible to ignore these days.
Climate change.
You got it, but with a really interesting twist.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
We're talking youth climate activism, specifically focusing on the incredible stories of young women leading the charge. And we're using the book Climate Sisters, Resisting Ecocide, as our guide.
I've heard of that one. Isn't it about how young women, especially from marginalized communities, are often hit hardest by climate change?
Exactly. It's not just about the environmental impact, but the social inequalities that get amplified by it. And it doesn't sugarcoat anything. Right off the bat, the book throws out some heavy stats, like how much the Earth has already warmed.
Yeah, like over 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. That's a huge change.
Huge. And makes that whole hottest year on record thing hit even harder, you know? Like 2023 just blew past all the records.
It's easy to forget those are global averages, too. Some regions are being slammed way harder than others. The book drives home how countries with histories of colonization are often on the front lines of the climate crisis, facing more extreme impacts.
Which is why it's so important to hear from those most affected, right? And this book really puts their voices front and center.
Absolutely. Their experiences challenge the status quo and offer unique solutions that often get overlooked.
Speaking of shaking things up, we can't talk about youth climate activism without mentioning Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, right?
For sure. The book does a great job of capturing how her solo school strike snowballed into this global phenomenon.
Talk about a ripple effect. But it's not just FFF. The book highlights all these other youth-led organizations like Climate Cardinals and Earth Uprising that have sprung up, each with their own unique approaches to tackling the climate crisis.
It really underscores how much power there is in grassroots movements. These aren't top-down organizations. They're driven by the passion and urgency of young people demanding a livable future.
And speaking of passionate young people, let's talk about Autumn Peltier. Imagine being so connected to your heritage, to water itself, that you become an activist at 8 years old.
8. Wow, that's incredible.
Right. Autumn's from Canada, an Anishinaabe indigenous activist who's become a powerful voice for water protection. She's literally following in her great-aunt Josephine Mandeman's footsteps, you know, the incredible water walker who circled the Great Lakes to raise awareness.
Oh, right. What a legacy to carry on.
Totally. And she's making waves of her own. At 13, she was addressing the UN General Assembly, urging world leaders to remember that water is a human right.
That takes guts. And her message is even more powerful when you consider that Canada, despite its green reputation, has its own environmental issues. The book points out their surprisingly high greenhouse gas emissions, largely due to their fossil fuel industry.
It's a good reminder that even countries we perceive as environmentally conscious have contradictions to confront. And speaking of confronting complex issues, let's talk about Leala Pourier.
Leala's story is a powerful one. She's a member of the Oglala Lakota and Cheyenne River tribes in the United States, and at just 23, she's already a leader with Earth Guardians.
And her message is crystal clear. We're not the owners of the land, we're the stewards of the land. Especially relevant when you think about the politicized mess the climate crisis has become in the U.S., right?
Totally. The book talks about how some politicians and communities in the U.S. are living with this head-in-the-sand approach to climate change, while others, like Leala and her community, are already facing the devastating consequences.
And those consequences often hit marginalized communities the hardest. The book talks about how indigenous populations, especially, are on the front lines of environmental damage, facing things like extreme weather and displacement far more frequently.
It's a stark reminder of the inequities baked into the system.
And it goes even deeper than that. Leala's shining a light on another horrifying consequence of all this: the violence experienced by indigenous women near oil pipeline camps. It's this whole other layer of injustice tied directly to environmental exploitation.
It's a truly heartbreaking connection, but it really underscores her message that indigenous justice and climate justice are inseparable. You can't have one without the other.
100%.
Right.
And from the front lines of indigenous rights, we turn to someone pushing for big picture change in U.S. climate policy. Varshini Prakash.
Oh, yeah, the co-founder of the Sunrise Movement, right? They've
Yeah.
become a major force in pushing for the Green New Deal.
Exactly. And she's only 31, but her activism goes way back. She was organizing fossil fuel divestment campaigns in college.
Wow, talk about walking the walk. So many people get into this stuff later in life, but she's been at it for a while.
It's like she's always understood the power of aligning your actions with your beliefs. And that dedication shows in how much Sunrise has grown. They've mobilized so many young people to demand action on climate change.
They're definitely shifting the conversation, taking ideas that were once considered radical and making them part of the mainstream political debate.
It's about being bold and unapologetic in pushing for solutions, and that's something we see a lot of in the book. Now, let's shift gears from policy debates to the front lines of climate disaster with Izzy Raj-Seppings' story.
Okay, I vaguely remember something about her. Wasn't she in the news a few years ago? Something about Australia.
You're thinking of that iconic photo 13-year-old Izzy staring down riot police amidst the devastating Australian bushfires of 2019.
Right, that image went viral. It was like this stark visual representation of an entire generation's fear and frustration about climate inaction.
And the book delves into what led up to that moment. Australia's reliance on fossil fuels, especially coal, has made them extremely vulnerable to climate change. Bushfires, droughts, floods, they're all becoming more frequent and intense because of it.
It really highlights how for many people, climate change isn't some abstract threat for the future. It's already their reality. And Izzy's defiance, that unwavering stare in that photo, it resonated with young people around the world who feel ignored by those in power.
It's like she became the symbol of youth activism, a reminder that this generation won't be silenced and they're demanding accountability.
Absolutely. Her story, while rooted in Australia's unique challenges, speaks to a universal anxiety young people are feeling about the future. It transcends geographical boundaries.
It's that shared experience of looking at the world and thinking, this isn't the future I signed up for. And now we're going to meet someone who's channeling that frustration into action with a focus on intersectionality. María Reyes from Mexico.
Intersectionality.
Yeah.
How does that play into her climate activism?
Well, for María, it's about understanding that climate change doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It intersects with all these other social justice issues.
Okay, so it's about recognizing how those existing inequalities based on gender, race, and socioeconomic status are made even worse by the climate crisis.
Exactly. And she walks the talk. At 21, she's already a leading voice in Fridays for Future Mexico and other international organizations, always advocating for those most vulnerable to climate change.
I'm always impressed by young people like her who are so globally minded, working across borders on these issues.
Well, it's personal for her. The book talks about how she grew up near a volcano in Pueblo, Mexico, and saw firsthand how water scarcity and corporate greed for natural resources devastated communities like hers. It's what fueled her activism.
It's a stark reminder that climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It has huge social, economic, and human rights implications.
100%. And María gets that, which is why she's not afraid to call out the big players. She's taking on Pemex, the massive state-owned oil company in Mexico, and holding them accountable for their role in fueling the climate crisis.
That's gutsy, especially considering how dangerous it can be to challenge those kinds of powerful corporations.
For real. The book really emphasizes the risks these young women are taking by speaking truth to power.
It's not just about speaking out either. They're putting themselves on the line in very real ways, often facing backlash, harassment, or even legal action.
It makes their dedication even more remarkable. And it feels like their message is really gaining traction, you know? The book talks about the surge in youth climate activism, and it's something I've noticed too. Have you seen that in your own work?
Totally. There's definitely a shift happening. And it's not just about the numbers, though the sheer scale of youth mobilization is incredible. It's the energy and diversity of these movements that's so inspiring.
Right. It's not just one type of person or one set of talking points anymore. Young people from all walks of life, from every corner of the globe, are coming together around this issue.
Exactly. And they refuse to be siloed by geography or background. There's this deep understanding that the climate crisis doesn't discriminate, and neither can we in fighting it.
It's like they innately get that this is a shared fight for a shared future. And I think that's what's catching so many people off guard. For so long, the powers that be have been able to dismiss climate change as some future problem, right? But these young activists are saying, no, this is our present, and we're not going to stand by and watch our future get trashed.
Totally. They're cutting through the BS.
Yeah.
Injecting this much-needed sense of urgency and moral clarity into the climate conversation.
And it's not just about anger, either. It's about justice, right? For future generations, for communities on the front lines.
Absolutely. They're shifting the focus from individual responsibility to collective accountability. It's not just about what you or I can do to reduce our carbon footprint. It's about dismantling the systems that got us into this mess in the first place.
Okay, so how do we do that? What can we do to actually support these young activists, amplify their voices, and contribute to this movement in meaningful ways?
Well, the book really stresses the importance of education. And I don't just mean understanding the science of climate change, though that's obviously crucial. It's about digging deeper, examining the root causes of this crisis, and understanding how it intersects with other social justice issues.
So it's not just about knowing the what, but also the why and the how behind climate change.
Right. Because once you understand the problem and its unequal impact on different communities, it's a lot harder to turn a blind eye.
Knowledge is power. So educate ourselves, and then what?
Well, knowledge without action is meaningless, right? The book encourages us to move beyond simply understanding the problem to taking concrete steps to address it.
Like what? Give us the goods.
It can be as simple as reducing your own carbon footprint through conscious consumption. It can mean becoming more politically active, contacting your elected officials and demanding bolder climate policies. Or maybe it's supporting organizations like the ones these climate sisters are part of.
Okay, so it's about this multi-pronged approach. Individual action, systemic change, using your voice, and putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And recognizing that we need both individual and collective action to create meaningful and lasting change.
And that can feel overwhelming, right? Like, where do you even start? But I think that's why these stories in Climate Sisters are so important. They remind us that even small acts of courage and resistance can have a ripple effect.
For sure. And they're not waiting for permission or some perfect moment to act. They're jumping in, figuring it out as they go, and inspiring others along the way.
It's about reclaiming that sense of agency, realizing that our actions do matter. And you brought up something earlier that I wanted to circle back to storytelling. It's clearly a powerful tool these young women are using.
Absolutely. They're masters at weaving together personal narratives with hard-hitting facts to create these compelling stories that resonate on an emotional level.
Can you give us an example? Like, how has one of the Climate Sisters used storytelling effectively in their activism?
Well, take Leala Pourier's work, highlighting the violence faced by Indigenous women near oil pipeline camps. By sharing those heartbreaking stories, she's not just talking about climate change in the abstract. She's connecting it to real-life consequences, forcing people to confront the human cost of our addiction to fossil fuels.
It's about making the issue impossible to ignore. And speaking of reaching a wider audience, we can't forget the role of social media in all of this. I mean, Izzy's story probably wouldn't have blown up the way it did without that powerful photo being shared online.
Oh, for sure. Social media is a double-edged sword. But these climate sisters are using it masterfully. They're not just randomly posting. They're strategically using social media to control the narrative and reach a global audience.
Which is crucial when traditional media outlets often fail to grasp the nuances of their message or just completely overlook them.
Totally. They're organizing online campaigns, sharing powerful images and videos, and sparking conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. It's about meeting people where they are, and let's be real, for a lot of young people, that's online.
They're digital natives using the tools at their disposal, but their activism isn't limited to the virtual world, is it?
Not at all. These women are organizing protests, leading climate strikes, meeting with elected officials. They're out there doing the work on the ground. And I think that's what makes them so inspiring. They're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk.
They're out there proving that age is just a number when it comes to making a difference. They're not waiting for someone else to give them permission or a pat on the head. It's about taking charge, creating their own opportunities to make a difference. And it's working.
That's what's so amazing to see. These climate sisters are having a real impact, both in their own communities and on a global scale.
It's like they've gone from local activists to leading voices in the global movement for climate justice.
Totally. They're being invited to speak at international forums, those big UN climate change conferences. They're sharing the stage with world leaders, challenging them to step up their game.
And they're not just there to make nice, are they? They're calling out hypocrisy, pushing for real, concrete action that actually matches the scale of this crisis.
It's refreshing, honestly. They're bringing the voices and experiences of those most impacted by climate change to these tables where decisions are being made and they're not holding back.
They're changing the narrative around climate change, right? It's not just an environmental issue anymore. It's a human rights issue, a social justice issue, an economic issue. All these things are connected.
It's that intersectional lens that's so crucial, and they're helping people see those connections.
And hopefully inspiring others to take action, because we're seeing this surge in youth-led movements all over the world, and that's got to be encouraging, right?
Absolutely. It's a generation that understands the stakes, and they're not afraid to fight for their future. There's a real sense of hope there, a belief that change is possible.
Because it is, right? It has to be.
It does. And these climate sisters are a big part of why that hope exists. They're showing us that even amidst a global crisis, there's still room for courage, for determination, and for that unwavering belief that a better world is possible. And not just possible, but necessary.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Climate Sisters, paint us a picture. What does the world these young women are fighting for actually look like?
It's a world where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has access to clean air and water, safe housing, economic opportunity, the basics.
The things everyone deserves, but so many are denied.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where we're not just surviving, but thriving. And that means transitioning away from fossil fuels, protecting biodiversity, and building a more equitable and just society.
A complete overhaul of the systems that got us into this mess in the first place.
It's a tall order, but these climate sisters are showing us it's not impossible. Their stories are a reminder that even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect, that our collective action can create a tidal wave of change. We don't need to wait for permission to make a difference. Whether it's educating ourselves, challenging the status quo, or supporting those on the front lines, we can all be climate sisters in our own way.
Beautifully said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the inspiring stories of Climate Sisters resisting ecocide. Remember, a better world is possible, but we have to fight for it.